Now, few American presidents have been subjected to the degree of outright ridicule that Warren Harding endured during his lifetime and continues to receive long after his death. But the conventional wisdom about Harding is wrong to the point of absurdity. As I intend to show, he understood more about how the economy functions than all the rest of the 20th century American presidents combined. He was much more well-read than most American presidents. He is accused of being corrupt. If only the U.S. government had the level of corruption that prevailed during the Warren Harding years. In the Warren Harding years, it's true, nobody right out in the open handed billions of dollars to major Wall Street firms. That's true. We had to wait until today for that. Today they don't call that corruption. They call that public policy, counter-cyclical policy. Harding's corruption consisted of one of his underlings selling government hospital supplies on the side and making a little profit. Well, I wish that were the extent of the corruption at that level occurs every 4.3 seconds in the United States today. And in fact, in 2 cases, when the corruption was actually brought to Harding's attention, he castigated the offender so severely that in both cases, the offender went out and committed suicide. So no one wants to be lectured to by Harding. It's fatal, apparently. But what they hate about Harding most is precisely that he did so little. He smoked, he drank alcohol at a time when it was illegal, he gambled in the White House, but it was a simpler America. It was an America in which if you knocked on the front door of the White House, Warren Harding would answer the door. Impossible to imagine our great imperial majesty even dreaming of such a thing today. But what they despise about him is that the economic performance of the country during his term was astonishing, considering what he started with. And so, if a guy as stupid as they say Harding was could have been such an economic success, maybe the economy is self-regulating after all. And our historians do not want to reach that conclusion. In his 1920 speech accepting the Republican presidential nomination, Harding said as follows: "We will attempt intelligent and courageous deflation." He would be shot for this today. "And strike at government borrowing which enlarges the evil. And we will attack high cost of government with every energy and facility which attend Republican capacity. We promise that relief which will attend the halting of waste and extravagance and the renewal of the practice of public economy, not alone because it will relieve tax burdens, but because it will be an example to stimulate thrift and economy in public life." Thrift and economy in public life. Notice, he does not say to everyone, the solution is to run out to the mall and spend all your money. "Let us call to all the people for thrift and economy." So he repeats it. "For denial and sacrifice, if need be. For a nationwide drive against extravagance and luxury." Now I think maybe he's going a little too far. "To a recommittal to simplicity of living, to that prudent and normal plan of life which is the health of the Republic. There hasn't been a recovery from the waste and abnormalities of war since the story of mankind was first written, except through work and saving, through industry and denial. while needless spending and heedless extravagance have marked every decay in the history of nations. Now you see why the American historical profession says he was so stupid. We all know this is the opposite of what needs to be done. We need extravagance and luxury to see us through. Well, it is hardly necessary to point out that Harding's counsel, delivered in the context of a speech to a political convention, no less, and he went on to win the election after saying these things. This is the opposite of what the alleged experts urge upon us today. Inflation, increased government spending, and assaults on private savings, combined with calls for consumer profligacy. Such is the program for recovery in the 21st century. Now, not surprisingly, many modern economists who have studied the Depression of 1920 to 21 have been unable to explain how the recovery could have been so swift and sweeping, even though the federal government and the Federal Reserve refrained from employing any of the macroeconomic tools, public works spending, government deficits, inflationary monetary policy, that conventional wisdom now recommends as the solution to economic slowdowns. The Keynesian economist Robert A. Gordon, who's written a lot on economic history, admitted that government policy to moderate the Depression and speed recovery was minimal. The Federal Reserve authorities were largely passive. Despite the absence of a stimulative government policy, however, recovery was not long delayed. Of course, Professor Gordon then draws no conclusions from this episode. Another economic historian briskly conceded that the economy rebounded quickly from the 1920 to 21 Depression and entered a period of quite vigorous growth, but chose not to comment further on this development. That is, by the way, the customary Keynesian treatment, is not to ignore the episode, as most people do today, to acknowledge it rather in one sentence and then proceed to the next chapter. Nothing to see here, people. No significance to this episode whatsoever. One Keynesian historian, rather condescendingly, says, "This was 1921, long before the concept of countercyclical policy was accepted or even understood." Well, they may not have understood countercyclical policy, but recovery came anyway, and quickly. One of the most perverse treatments of the subject comes at the hands of two historians of the Harding presidency who urge that without government confiscation of much of the income of the wealthiest Americans, the American economy will never be stable. Now, by the way, as I'm reading this, imagine it reading as follows. Imagine this being two people saying that unless the mafia takes a portion of your income, prosperity will never return. Just imagine it that way. Imagine instead of government, we replace mafia. The tax cuts, along with the emphasis on repayment of the national debt and reduced federal expenditures, combined to favor the rich. Many economists came to agree that one of the chief causes of the Great Depression of 1929 was the unequal distribution of wealth, which appeared to accelerate during the 1920s, and which was a result of the return to normalcy. Return to normalcy is the phrase that Warren Harding ran on in 1920. That's the reference there. And there is, by the way, there is no word normalcy in English. It's normality. So this was another reason for people to laugh at Harding. He doesn't even know the English word that he's trying to say. 5%, I'm continuing to read these historians, 5% of the population had more than 33% of the nation's wealth by 1929. This group failed to use its wealth responsibly, said the mafia. Oh, sorry, that wasn't in there. Instead, they fueled unhealthy speculation on the stock market as well as uneven economic growth. Therefore, the mafia had to take their money. Again, I added that in. But that is the rationale here. That if you leave money in private hands, what happens? Wild speculation, stock market bubbles. So for your own good, we need to confiscate that money. And by we don't mean we. We mean they. They are going to confiscate it. But notice this. Don't you love historians? How much they know about economics. I'm always in admiration of historians for their deep knowledge and their extensive reading in the discipline of economics. Now that was sarcasm. That was actually not true. Historians don't know a thing about economics, and I myself am a historian. I like to think I know a little more than the average. But notice no mention of the Federal Reserve System here. That unhealthy speculation on the stock market apparently just occurred. Right? It has no explanation. People had money, so they speculated. How this sort of thing could occur in the absence of an increase in the supply of credit, well, these questions are left unanswered. The Federal Reserve's inflationary monetary policy fueling the stock market boom, no mention of that. It's all because people were allowed to keep their money. And again, the argument is that the distribution of wealth was uneven, that the rich had too much. 5% had 33% of the nation's wealth, which is a crazy commie phrase anyway, the nation's wealth. It's not like the country, the whole country has a big pile of stuff, and then one night when everybody's sleeping, a few of them come grab a big portion of it, and then they have a lot of it. It's not actually how it works. They create this wealth themselves. So somebody who heads a corporation that helps to feed 3 million people might in fact earn a much higher salary than somebody who sweeps the floor in an office building. This is nothing sinister about this. But the suggestion is that if the rich have too much, they'll either spend it stupidly or the poor won't have enough money to buy the stuff the economy is selling and all this. Well, that's a whole other question. But if this were correct, if this theory were correct, that the so-called maldistribution of resources leads to economic booms and busts, then the world would be in a constant state of depression. Because we see proportions like that everywhere in the world at all times, usually much greater. 5% having 33% is frankly quite modest. And yet we don't see depressions all over the place. In fact, the Great Depression actually came in the midst of a dramatic upward trend in the share of national income devoted to wages and salaries in the U.S., and a downward trend in the share going to interest, dividends, and entrepreneurial income. So to achieve prosperity, thank goodness, we do not in fact require the violent expropriation of any American. Joseph Schumpeter, another of the great 20th century economists, pointed to the 1920-21 example as a case that he said alone proves that you don't need any sort of counter-cyclical policy, that in fact the system regulates and corrects itself. He said that this alone proves it, because this shouldn't have happened otherwise. There's no reason this should have happened unless in fact the market can correct imbalances created by artificial credit expansion. Now, it's not enough to demonstrate that prosperity happened to follow upon the absence of fiscal or monetary stimulus. We need to understand why this outcome is to be expected. In other words, why the restoration of prosperity in the absence of the remedies urged upon us in more recent times was not an inconsequential curiosity or the result of mere happenstance. So first we have to consider why the market economy is afflicted by the boom-bust cycle in the first place.